Please welcome Paul Horsted.
Thank you. See if we can wake this up again. Oh, what's that password again? Dog's name. Okay, there we go. Yay. Well, thank you for coming, and obviously the early bird gets the soup, I heard, but I enjoyed mine. I'm sorry I shorted somebody else out there. Well, again, thank you so much for coming out today. This program is a little less polished perhaps than some of those you may have seen me do. I haven't done as much work on this, although I am grabbing bits and pieces from programs I've done in the past, and I hope you enjoy it regardless. A lot of you maybe know, but for those of you I haven't had the pleasure to meet, a lot of what I do is trying to match up historic photos with a modern photo, you know, put my camera in the same spot and try to get the lighting and the angle and everything the same as possible. And so that general idea of rephotography has become the basis of several books that we've produced over the last 20 years. My wife, Camille Reiner, is the graphic designer. We act as the publishers. We send these to a printer, and then we find our way in the world selling these around the Black Hills and some other places. We've done a book on some national parks with this theme, and one on Yellowstone, as well as some stuff here in the Black Hills, including our, as Mark said, our revised 4th edition that just came out last summer, Exploring with Custer. So we thank you, readers who have purchased one. I saw one or two floating around out here already, and talked to somebody beforehand who had wanted to get a book today. That's what makes whatever it is I do possible over time, and it's all self-funded, so thank you for that support. Well, talking about Black Elk Peak, which I'm going to lapse and call Harney Peak on more than one occasion here, probably just because that term was used, that name in the historic past, of course, applied to these photos. This is a panoramic view I just re-photographed a few years ago. Most of those dead trees you see at lower right there have now fallen over, and we'll see some examples of that going forward here as I get into the program. But so the name Harney Peak, as I understand it, again, this is all, some of you may know more about this than I do, but you can chat later if you'd like. The name was applied in 1855, as I understand it, by G.K. Warren, a military officer who was traveling east of the Black Hills. You could see the Black Hills in the distance like we can driving up along I-90 or whatever, but they didn't actually go there. They just saw it and said, hey, we're going to name that for Harney, who, by the way, just, massacred a bunch of Lakota down at Ash Hollow down in Nebraska that same year. So, I mean, it is a sad story, and it's understandable why a number of people felt strongly about changing that name. I'm kind of neutral on that, but I do use both terms, as I say, relating to history. Of course, there were Native Americans coming to this area way before any whites explored the summit of Black Elk Peak. We assume they were up there as well. I personally can remember a ring of stones buried in the ground on top of Little Devil's Tower, which isn't that far from Harney Peak or Black Elk Peak. That's all gone now. It's just been eroded away by all the foot traffic and so on. But I remember seeing that many, many years ago. And on the summit of Black Elk Peak, we do see prayer flags and so on. This is obviously a sacred place for the Lakota and the Kiowa Apache and the Shoshone and the Crow Indians and the Arikara and the Rees and the Mindan and Hittite. All of these tribes, traveled to the Black Hills historically before settlement, before maybe the Lakota were here, for example. So they all have ties and think of it as a holy place. I have a photo here of Black Elk, the man himself, taken from the Neihart books on Black Elk Speaks, and some of the other books that I believe it's John G. Neihart did, recorded in the 1930s. So we have a really great perspective on what that meant to the Lakota, at least in their religion. But I'm going to start now with just the white history, you might say, as we understand it, or as I understand it anyway. And that kind of starts with the Black Hills expedition, although there were some earlier parties exploring around the Black Hills, the periphery, and a little bit into the hills, and then obviously the rumors of gold miners coming here way before gold was officially discovered. But they came here in 1874, and I have a whole lecture on this. If you've missed that the last few weeks, I've done that a few times around the hills as our new edition came out. But one basic reason they came was because the map of this area was essentially a blank spot, and so they're interested in mapping the Black Hills for the military's purposes, but that would include then climbing summits like Black Elk Peak and other summits so that they could apply those to the map in an accurate way, as we'll kind of talk about. So the 1874 expedition resulted in basically these 3 maps that were published in an official report to Congress in 1875, and so they had a map of the geology, one of their whole route from way up in North Dakota, or present-day North Dakota, where they came from, and then one showing their route and some of the terrain in the Black Hills that they were able to map in 1874. And they had a sophisticated set of tools for doing that. This odometer cart always fascinated me. This was just a cart that rode alongside the wagon train. They had two of these actually, and recorded the revolutions of the wheel, and then they would calculate that into miles traveled at the end of the day for the wagon train as they were coming down to the Black Hills and passing through the Black Hills. And we found this mileage between their camps to be quite accurate as we go about today. We know where one camp is and where the next camp is, and you can retrace that, and within a very small percentage of accuracy. So that's kind of neat. And then they, of course, were taking latitude and longitude readings using a sextant for the latitude and a chronometer for the longitude. And the latitude is usually quite accurate. It slices right through the camps. We think they probably also took latitude and longitude at some of these mountain summits like Black Elk Peak, but don't know that for sure. And the chronometer was the longitude, a little more complicated to calculate longitude, so those are sometimes off by 1 to 3 miles, those readings. But all of that data got compiled and put into this official report that the maps and other reports were included in, and so they did record, as you can see here, their latitude and longitude of all of their campsites, and surprising accuracy that then gets transferred into the map that they developed, which when you scan it and zoom in or look at it with a magnifying glass is quite detailed, and we find fairly accurate as well. So this map shows there, lower left, you see present-day Custer, South Dakota. That's where the town of Custer is, where they camped for 2 days on July 30 and 31 of 1874, and then they moved east of town, or where the town would be founded, and stayed for 5 days at what they called their permanent camp. And we've got Black Elk Peak on there, the former Harney Peak, as they called it. They got the elevation, it says 9,700 feet on Harney Peak, and that was obviously wrong. They did, all of their elevations seemed to run high, so they had trouble getting an accurate elevation. That may have been, I think they were using a barometer to measure elevation back then, and that may have been, obviously, had some accuracy issues. So as the wagon train comes into the Black Hills, they kind of came in from the west. They came in from Wyoming, essentially, down Floral Valley, and then the Castle Creek Valley up there by Deerfield, and then eventually down to the area where the town of Custer would be founded, and that's where they found gold, and a lot of other stuff happened. But as the wagon train's coming in, the Custer and Ludlow was the chief engineer who did the mapping on this expedition, General Custer, of course, and others. When they were able, they would summit, they would climb any peak they went by, hoping to see the route ahead, and also just kind of getting the lay of the land. So they were seeing Harney Peak or Black Elk off in the distance at times, even from the west. But this view is kind of pretty much what they would have seen the first time they kind of encountered those granite formations that we're familiar with in the central part of the Black Hills. And this is from Medicine Mountain Road, about, 8 or 10, interesting, about 8 or 10 miles northwest of the town of Custer, and along Medicine Mountain Road there, you just go down the woods a ways, and that's a photo site where William Henry Illingworth took this picture, he being the photographer on this expedition, who took about 50 photos like this around the Black Hills. And so this one, he literally titled it Harney Peak at a distance of 10 miles. So he's trying to record the peak in the distance there, just peeking up over the mountain range in the foreground there, in the middle ground. That little diamond-shaped piece of rock is about a mile north of Crazy Horse Memorial. So you're right in that valley when you come out of Custer and go north towards Hill City. You drive by that, and then Harney Peak is over the ridge. You can't really see it from that vantage point. But in any case, he's trying to record the first view of Harney Peak, it would seem, in that photo. So on July 31st, after they get to this campsite where the town of Custer would be founded a year later, they take a reconnaissance, as they called it. So you got the wagon train. I didn't get into this. It's kind of my Custer expedition lecture, but there's like 110 wagons and 1,000 people on this expedition. Most of them stayed in camp when this reconnaissance up to Black Elk Peak was taken by Custer and Ludlow, and there was a guy named Winchell who was the chief geologist on this expedition, and a couple companies of cavalry. So probably a couple hundred people all together were going up Black Elk Peak, but they didn't bring the wagon train along. They're all just riding horses and so on. So that's what these that little route with the square boxes is showing, their route up and then a route back. And that was on July 31st of 74. And when you get up near Harney Peak, you kind of see they went to a first summit, and then they went to a second summit, and then they finally go to the last summit. And this is described in their diaries and journals and the reports we have from that day quite clearly, that they thought they were getting to the summit the first time, but they found out it really wasn't. And so nowadays we use Google Earth quite a bit, and you can literally trace this route and put it into a GPS and follow that on the ground. And it's not perfectly accurate, but it's close. You can tell you're down in this drainage, or they went by this particular peak. And so really just a few weeks ago, I did this with a friend of mine. We decided we would try to hike as much of this as we could. I kind of looked at it back in 2009, but it's kind of a sub-story. This isn't the most significant thing that happened on the expedition, but it's something I'd always been curious about. So you get into Google Earth and you can tilt the images around and kind of look at what they might have been going to when they mapped this. And so from the Needles Highway, this little reconnaissance that came up from Custer towards Black Elk Peak, of course, crossed the Needles Highway, or would have the future Needles Highway, and you look out from an area just east of the tunnel where the Cathedral Spires area is, and you see these sub-peaks, I'll call them, of Black Elk Peak. But from that point, you don't know Harney Peak or Black Elk is hiding back behind there. You just see like this really tall mountain. So we think they were heading for that one just above the walking sticks there to the left, or possibly the one to the right. But we hiked up, and my buddy and I, up to that one summit, the one on the right. It's terrible hiking. There's no trails in that area. We crossed like Trail 4 once, I think, but that was about it. Mostly it's down timber from the mountain pine beetle still, and then new trees growing up, and you're just like in a jungle a lot of the time when you can, until you get up onto the bare granite. So this is up on that first peak I looked at there. It does look kind of like Black Elk or Harney Peak at the top. But not exactly, but there's great views in every direction. But when you look towards where we know Harney Peak or Black Elk is today, there is this obstruction, this other peak. And we didn't have the energy the day we did this a few weeks ago to hike to that second one. We were just wanting to get back. He and I are both in our local search and rescue there. We did not want to have to call search and rescue. So we headed back down before it got dark. The days are getting kind of short. But in 2009, I did go to that second peak. I went right to it and just kind of looked around. I barely knew what I was doing. If I do now, I don't know. But you could again see it's just a tree-covered hill, but Black Elk is right behind it, off in the distance, but you don't know that from this vantage point, right? So your Custer stand there, they literally said, we fired our guns in the air, we were up the summit, and then we kind of went, wait a minute, there's this other thing looming on the horizon there. So we went up there, and so this is part of the sketch that the geologist, a guy named Winchell, who was from the University of Minnesota, professional geologist, was asked to come on the expedition and report on geology. And so what it says there in that central thing, if you read it, it says, this hides Harney. So he's got, this little hill, this hides Harney. And then off on the right, it says Harney's Peak, 1,012 feet above the creek on the south. And this is a very rough sketch. And again, these guys were in a hurry. He was on horseback. This isn't a work of art, but over on the right it says plains, and then in the middle there it says bare rock. I think he's talking the B-A-R-E. I think he's talking about Little Devil's Tower, which has got this barren rock formation. And then he's got the Oregon Peaks on the left, which are the cathedral spires. They call them the Oregon Pipes or the Oregon Peaks back then. And then this hides Harney. So he's trying to sketch what he's seeing for future reference, and maybe as a way to find their way back in a little while. But they finally get up on that other summit and they can see Black Elk off in the distance or Harney, and they go, oh, there we go. That's what we got to get to. So they do finally get up there late in the afternoon, and Winchell draws a little more coherent sketch here near the summit, which you can kind of match up. I mean, I'm sure these are the formations he was trying to draw. I'm not sure I've found quite the right angle there yet, but the mountain pine beetle cleared a lot of trees out of there, and that's made this a little bit easier to digest when you get up there and start looking around. But that sketch is interesting and ended up in his final published report too. Eventually they do get to the top. They have trouble climbing the final summit. Those final towers that you see there gave them trouble, but they were able from there, even though they weren't at the very top, to see other landmarks like Bear Butte at upper right there. They could, you can see Bear Butte from Black Elk Peak today, and places like Custer Peak and Terry's Peak, which were named on this expedition, for Custer and General Terry, of course. So they could see those, which they would be passing by in a week or two. And so again, they're getting an idea, well, we've got to go north, and we're going to be seeing these mountains again from the wagon train once we get up there, and so they were kind of looking for that ahead. And certainly Bear Butte, they wanted to know where that was because it was such a landmark that they were sort of familiar with from the Indian scouts helping them find their way to the Black Hills. So that's on their map. So Winchell wrote, once they got to the top of Black Elk, but not to the summit, they're below those towers. This, however, was not the summit. Another perpendicular wall confronted us, rising about 45 feet. And they tried briefly to climb it, and if you go up there today, you can kind of see maybe what they were doing. There's a chute that is a pretty obvious climbing point, but there's a big boulder kind of hanging there, and it's a little intimidating. It hasn't fallen out now in over 100 years, but they stopped there. They couldn't go any higher because the sun had already set. A long return march was before us. We made but a short stay on the summit. The outline of the summit of Harney Peak is in my sketch, shown by the profile here. Taking samples of the rock and driving an empty copper cartridge case into a cleft in the granite, we left therein our names and the day of the month and began a long and tiresome night march back to camp. So a couple of things to talk about there. He used a geologist, so he took rock samples everywhere he went, and a lot of these rock samples he collected in the Black Hills are still in the collection up at the University of Minnesota. But the cartridge case, it would have been like you see here, and this is from that era, but not with the bullet in it. So they were apparently leaving a note in there for somebody to find, and some of you probably know this. Watson Parker, a famous Black Hills historian, author of many books, who passed away a few years ago, told me that his dad had found that up there on Black Elk Peak back in the 30s, but the family didn't know where it was, and they didn't find anything in it. Apparently they did open it. His grandson James is a pal of mine, and has been looking for this cartridge all these years, as they unpack stuff from the state and so on, but no go so far on the empty cartridge. That might be the one that Custer and Winchell left at the summit there. So just a little interesting story there. Another little side story to this, while Winchell and Custer and two companies of cavalry are up there fighting their way through the woods towards Black Elk Peak, this was going on down in the valley below at the campsite. The famous Champagne Supper, also held on July 31st, 1874. So this is like a brief commercial message from the new book that we just did. Because some of you have heard my lecture on this, have heard already, we think we found the photo site for this one, or corrected it from the earlier edition, let's put it that way. We moved it about a block from where we kind of thought where it was before, and this one looks a lot better, and I won't get into all of that, but it is kind of fun to think about that. And that's in the town of Custer, adjacent to the Mickelson Trail, and the location is in the book if you want to go look at it. But so another, bringing this back to Harney Peak or Black Elk Peak, is another picture that the photographer Illingworth took in 1874, which he titled Godfrey Peak. And Godfrey was an officer, one of the officers on the expedition serving under Custer, who, along with others, would go on these recons or reconnaissances to side valleys and do some mapping. And we assume, we don't really know what the mechanics were, but report back to Ludlow what they had found, how far the valley went, where that stream ended up at, that sort of thing. And so Illingworth was with him at least on one occasion, and as Illingworth did other places, he named, he put a name on his picture which may or may not have stuck in the modern world, right? He called this Godfrey Peak, and there's one called Grant's Peak, and a couple others named after wives of the officers on the expedition, Genevieve Park, and so on. None of those names survive in the mapping today. So, but this one he did call Godfrey Peak, and in 2000, when I guess I didn't mention this, but our book Exploring with Custer first came out in 2002, and this is what I presented then, just like a guess on where that location might be. I looked for weeks and weeks for this site, really. All over around Black Elk Peak and all the valleys that we knew Illingworth had worked in. And so we kind of put these in the book, just kind of like, we don't know, hopefully somebody else will figure this out. It's kind of, we have relied on our readers on a couple of occasions that really come through for us, and that's what happened here. Ken Marchand is a GIS or mapping specialist with the Forest Service, and a friend of mine, of course, and he told me later that he just started looking for big grassy plains like this near, some trees and rocks and kind of around the central part of the Black Hills, and whatever means he used that led him to the photo site, which to our surprise turned out to be a long ways from the next closest photo site. So Illingworth went north out of Custer, 4 or 5 miles, and shot a group of pictures, and then he went back into town, it seemed to us, back into that area. But this is a solitary single photo site all the way up about halfway to Hill City. It's where the Rafter J Bar campground is, where you turn on Highway 244 towards Mount Rushmore there, off of 385, back in the campground there. So it's way out of his normal orbit, you might say. We had no idea he went that far north. And I'll just mention that little hill on the right there is visible behind those campers. So we know this is really close to the actual site, but they obviously wandered out a little farther than we expected. And so he named this Godfrey Peak, not realizing he was looking at Harney's Peak, the same mountain he had photographed, a few days earlier along Medicine Mountain Road, because it doesn't look the same. It's more of a granite mass from this angle. So obviously nobody even knew they were looking at Harney Peak, and neither did I when I looked at this picture. So trying to figure out, where it was taken. But it's a little embarrassing always in retrospect when you can't figure something out. But that's basically the view you get coming from Custer, and you make a turn to the east, and it's hanging right up there above the mountain, above the hills, and you'll see that almost that same view. Or you can go out in the campground and take a look at it. So, and then Illingworth took another photo that I'm sure he did know he was looking at the Harney Peak range, or the Black Elk range there in the distance, and this is right above their campsite east of Custer, where they stayed for 5 days. You can go up on that rock. It's on the Forest Service, and appreciate this view for yourself as well. And the highway kind of cuts through the campsite there now, but Black Elk is off in the distance there behind the cathedral spires from this perspective. So he did get another picture of it, although he didn't apply that name. He just calls this one, I think he called it Permanent Camp, because that's what they call this particular location. So that's what I've got on the Custer expedition. We kind of move on to another year later, 1875, the Newton-Jenny expedition. Not as well known as Custer's expedition, but it's really significant. And they were in the hills from April to October of 1875. And Custer was only here for about 3 weeks, like July 20th to the 16th of August or something like that. So a much shorter period of time to map and explore. Newton-Jenny expedition was here for much longer, and a guy named Valentine McGillicuddy, who I think is this character right here, it's a little hard to tell, but it looks like him, was here most of that, if not all of that time. And so he was the surveyor, the topographer, as they called him, on this expedition. And later, of course, mayor of Rapid City, president of the School of Mines, present when Crazy Horse was killed. Quite a historical character here. A lot of artifacts of his in the Melaleuca collection, or the Black Hills Historical Society now collection in the museum here. So glad to see a picture of him anytime. They camped in 1875. One of their camps, I should say, was exactly where Custer had camped the year before. This pasture here is exactly where the tents were spread out in the picture I just showed you from up high looking down, just from another angle here. There's McGillicuddy and his cohort Horace Tuttle, who was an astronomer, and I don't know as much about this expedition, but I got a couple of things here I can share. Of course, McGillicuddy, his ashes are buried or entombed up on Harney Peak or Black Elk Peak. Now, in the staircase there, as you walk up just before the tower, there's this discreet little plaque where his ashes were put in, apparently in, I think, 1939. I have this other photo of him with his, the sign above that says Dr. McGillicuddy, I believe, office, and he's carrying his surveying equipment there. I don't know for sure where that picture originated or where it was taken or when. I think it's 1875. Maybe somebody here will know more about that. Let's see. So he's assigned to map the Black Hills in further detail than Custer and Ludlow was able to do in '74. And they, I think he wrote later, they ran every single watercourse. I mean, in the whole Black Hills, they mapped very thoroughly every drainage and mountain, and had a lot more time, as I say. So this is when they were heading for Harney Peak to go to the summit, which they had not done yet, on July 24th of 1875. This photo is actually called Breakfast Near Harney Peak. And their camp that I showed you a minute ago was called Camp Harney. So it's kind of odd for us, or at least it was for me, to call that Camp Harney. It's like 10 miles from Harney Peak, but in their mind they were on this, this big hill that was heading that direction. And the new photo here, I just kind of, I didn't think I'd ever find this one, but I did then see these rock formations which are on either side of the highway as you go up towards Sylvan Lake from Custer. You're driving up that valley, and those rock formations kind of bracket that, like a gateway there going up to Sylvan Lake. The actual site is, I think, in the woods nearby. It's just all trees there. You can't see anything, but I came out in the open there where the park has the sewer treatment plant for the Sylvan Lake, and then I got some opening there where you can see the background rocks. But the gentleman standing there is their black cook. I can't remember his name, but he was cooking for this crew. McGillicuddy is theoretically sitting over there with the rest of them. You can see one of the survey instruments there. So this is July 24th when they did, in fact, get all the way up to Black Elk Peak. McGillicuddy wrote about his experiences in 1875 in a 1928 article or two in Motor Travel magazine. And you keep your Facebook page going long enough, and a guy got a hold of me from Washington, D.C., of all places. He was at the Naval Observatory. I think he'd retired from there, and he was a big fan of Tuttle, the other guy. Tuttle came from the Naval Observatory, and I think in 1875, or his findings were later associated there. I may not have that quite straight, but in any case, we collaborated there a little bit, and he had found this article that McGillicuddy had written in 1928, which really is McGillicuddy's whole story of surveying Harney Peak and the Black Hills in 1875, and quite interesting to read. So he's showing here how he tied together the mountain peaks, and I'm not a surveyor, and some of you probably understand this way better than I do, but if you're on Custer Peak there in the middle, and you turn this way and you see Terry Peak, and you go that way in Bear Butte, then you go over to Bear Butte and shoot back and shoot this one, all of a sudden you've got a nice solid triangle, and you can place those on a map accurately. And same thing then with multiple peaks like this. And the one interesting, or several interesting things, but Crook's Tower, is really just a minor elevation in the Black Hills, but it does, when you stand on it, allow you to see Indian Cara to the west and Harney Peak off in the other direction, and Custer Peak. So that was a critical high point for him to do his mapping, he mentioned in his story. Let's see, what else have we got here? This is a photo, actually, amazingly, of McGillicuddy on top of Harney Peak on the summit in 1875 in this Motor Travel magazine. And so this picture somehow got published in Motor Travel earlier in the year, and the caption said Harney Peak, so that's what the editors said. This is Harney Peak. Somebody wrote in and said, that's not Harney Peak. Harney Peak's got this wooden fire tower on it. It looks completely different. And McGillicuddy had to write this rebuttal. And in here he literally says the Forest Service may have chosen to put the tower on another part of it, but we were on the tallest part of the mountain. And we knew what we were doing. And I believe he did. I designated the site of this picture as the Cathedral of Harney and its highest pinnacle, which we used as an observatory, the tower. So that's what they called it when they were there in 1875. It says photographed by Beneke. Oops, yeah, right up there, Beneke, St. Louis, 1875. Just a little side note, the photographer was a guy named Guerin, G-U-E-R-I-N, and his pictures of 1875 are way more hard to find, much harder to find than the photos that Illingworth took in 1874. He apparently sold his negatives to Beneke, who published them in St. Louis, where nobody seemed to care. So there aren't very many copies of these floating around. They have some in the State Historical Society and some over at Mitchell at Dakota Wesleyan. But I'm just throwing that out in case you come across anything like that that says Beneke on the back of the Black Hills. Very interested in any of that kind of material. But Yeah, so this is kind of laying this out, what we're talking about here. That pinnacle is the one that McGillicuddy was on top of in 1875, and then you can see where the tower is today. If you've been up there, you know what that is. It's about 300 feet south of there, and we were, I've always been interested in trying to figure out where these photo sites are. Eventually, I did photograph this one in, just a few years ago after the mountain pine beetle. But in 2005, when I first looked at it for our Black Hills Yesterday and Today book, basically there were trees in the way, kind of blocking the view. In fact, I think these two little trees are those two big trees. They kind of have the same shape. You can kind of see that there. And I'm not sure I appreciated that at the time. But and then by 2016, those and many millions of others have been killed by mountain pine beetle. Which I've kind of come to see as a good thing, by the way, but it suppressed a lot of fire potential, you might say, but that is another story. So now it's possible to see the peak, and so when I stand, hopefully in exactly the same spot, we've got McGillicuddy on the right with the survey thing there, and Tuttle on the left, and I can't remember who the guy in the middle is. I think we can figure that out, but I don't have it committed to memory, but you can see McGillicuddy's got his survey instrument there, and when you look at that really closely and compare it to a picture from the same location, the profile shifts quite a bit, and so I was interested in that because it's a change, and why would there be that change, and so we started kind of looking at that notion as time went by. I looked at it from the other direction. This is from the tower now, looking towards that spire, which is just south of the tower in 2016, and going back in time here, kind of 1928, it looked quite a bit the same, but in 1900, it definitely gained some mass. I mean, as you go back in time, there was more rock there, and so I think it's pretty clear that has changed for whatever reason. I guess I'm kind of beating it to death here just to show you one more view here, but it more or less matches up. So why might that have happened? Where did that rock go? It could be just natural freeze and thaw cycles, lightning strikes was a theory somebody gave me, or I think most likely just pushed off by people who were up there. I've done a lot of work in national parks, like the Grand Canyon, 1871, there's some cliff and there's just rocks all over. Now it's just like somebody took a broom and swept it, because every 10-year-old boy that ever got up there, threw a rock over home. It's probably 50-year-old boys, but so I think that, and also the CCC was really active up here. But it is true when you look down. Now this is standing right where McGillicuddy was, within a few feet. The rock is very, it's cracked and fractured and possibly changed. So, but he says here in this article, before leaving the summit on July 25th, they were there apparently overnight, we all signed our names on a card, corked the card in a bottle or empty pickle jar, one of the two, I guess, and requested that anyone subsequently making the ascent notify me by mail. And in the fall of 1876, while I was at Fort Robinson, I received a postal card from a man named Snow from Springfield or Yankton, Dakota. He had succeeded in making the ascent just a year later, and opened the jar on the summit of Harney Peak. So, and then lo and behold, again, friends on the internet here, so to speak, this guy named Don Holmes, who's with the U.S., it's called the High Pointers Club, I think, and they're having their convention in the Black Hills next summer, and I'm going to be speaking to them, but they want to, go up Black Elk Peak, and he had been digging on some stuff and found this letter to McGillicuddy from the guy that found the bottle on top of Harney Peak in 1876, and he says, I was the first to open the bottle, and, here I'm writing the letter as you requested. So, kind of cool to tie that together, but there obviously are, this is that spire now from another angle. I found this postcard on eBay that showed people up on top of it. So despite that it's not real easy to get up there, apparently a lot of people do visit it. And rock climbers now go up there occasionally. It's not the primary place they like to go, but they will visit that once in a while. So the missing rock appears to reduce the elevation of that location. I believe McGillicuddy and Tuttle were careful scientific men, and I believe it was taller than the nearby peak that we call the summit today. Horace Tuttle again wrote very seriously, observations on Harney were all at the highest point, which gave us much trouble and risk to reach. And McGillicuddy is talking about swinging the surveying telescope around and not seeing that this topped every other bit of granite near or far. I think there's a description of them leaning a tree against it to climb up, to get up on that summit. Sorry, I don't have that quote here, but that's what I recall they were actually doing when they got up there. But now, of course, with the construction of the tower in 1938, the highest point now is the one that most people recognize on Black Elk Peak. So, but there are, I do a lot of this re-photography thing, and going up there and doing it is a joy, because there's some really interesting photos. Those guys are scaring the bejeepers out of me looking at them. They're in a really tough spot there, but they obviously made it out. These were a photographer out of Custer who shot that. In 1897, the U.S. Geological Survey measured the altitude of Harney Peak, or the elevation, for the first time, apparently kind of on a really official basis. And we're going to talk about their findings in a little bit. And then in 1911 is this picture. This is the first structure at the very summit, as far as I'm aware. They just had a table sitting there in the open with a Osborne firefinder, which they were then starting to use for shooting bearings on forest fires starting. And then there was a telephone going down to, I suppose, Sylvan Lake or somewhere beyond that, where they could call those in. This happens to be some troopers in 1919 visiting Harney Peak. There's also some photos of them down at Sylvan Lake, but one of them happened to be standing on that table, and underneath, I believe what we're looking at here is a telephone box, that would have been used for that instant communication to transmit about a fire. Just below where the tower is today is this, some pictures of this cabin, this tent. That woman's holding a rifle. And so there was some kind of habitation. I don't have a lot of history on it, and somebody might have figured this all out and published it in a book. I haven't seen it. I want to be clear about that. I haven't dug into every source on this yet, or I haven't had the time or the need yet. But and then around 1919, this gentleman is in this cabin doorway, and this is right where all the water is stored now. If you go up to Harney and go west from the peak a little bit, you'll see kind of a dam enclosure. This was in that space. A guy named Earl J. Emmons, apparently, and I don't know what you were registering for, but there was something that said register here, and he's got a book there. Over on this log, it says meals, $5. Imagine with inflation what that would be today. So tough to get a meal out there, but just to give you the layout there, that cabin then, so that wooden tower is right where the current tower is, and then this cabin was just below that, to the west there a little bit. I call this the first tower. It's the first one after just the table, with three windows on the side, which was only there for about a year. But this is exactly in the same position, kind of showing the tower reference there. And then by 1921, they built a 5-window tower, which was there until the 1936 or 37 when they started building the stone tower in its place. As a more permanent structure. Enlarging this view, that sign says to see hotel, look through pipe. So there's a pipe there that if you, I guess, looked in there, you would see Sylvan Lake Hotel, which is where a lot of the tourists that were hiking up here, or riding burros more likely, riding mules, would have been able to see where they'd come from earlier that day. I'm not sure who's on the roof there, but this photo was dated 1927, and some of these come from Mark in the collection of the Middaloosa has a wonderful set of photo albums that some amateur guy named J.J. Anderson took just all over the Black Hills. And I always say amateur photos are in many ways more interesting than professional pictures, because they do shots like this that wouldn't have sold as a postcard but give us some other information. This is a postcard by a professional named Kennedy, but showing the cabin where souvenirs were sold, blankets were sold, drinks were sold. I think there was a post office in there. We were talking about that earlier today. Just below the summit, they're in a different location than that other cabin. This is kind of on your way as you hike up there. And this color postcard from the 60s, you can see a couple of buildings there down below the summit, which the bases of which are still in place. They park horses on this one, the foundation of that one cabin where people lived for a while. I believe the tower was no longer staffed by the Forest Service after 1967. I think I got that right. So those were just abandoned, and eventually they took them down. The plans for the tower construction still exist, or maybe these were done right after it was completed, I'm not sure, but they don't have McGillicuddy's box on there as far as I can tell. I got a feeling that was a late addition in the 1930s, and I did find this picture on eBay a while back that I purchased, just a snapshot from somebody's trip to the Black Hills where they happened to be there when the tower was under construction in, I guess that would be 1937 or 1938. And yeah, let's see. So if anybody has to get up and go, I don't want you to hesitate. If you all get up and go, then I'll be worried. But well, I've got a little time left, so I debated whether to tack this on, but, and I have done a program about this, but it's been a few years. I'm going to launch into it just because it ties into this a little bit. And this has to do with a survey of the elevation of Black Elk Peak that I sort of helped with back in 2016. A couple of guys that I'd met named Kurt Lubke and Jerry Penry, who are professional licensed surveyors. He's from Nebraska, Jerry's from Nebraska, Kurt's from Montana. They both have companies or, they do this kind of stuff all the time. And they like to go out and find historical survey markers, of which there are multiple. Like you go out along the western edge of the Black Hills, every so often there's going to be a marker where somebody laid out the boundary of the western edge of South Dakota in 1887 or something like that, before statehood. And so they go look for that sort of thing all over the country. And they love the Black Hills and had done some work here, and they were interested in the Custer Expedition surveys. And so we got to talking, and they realized nobody had surveyed Black Elk Peak since 1897. That's when they did a survey in 1897, and that's it. Nobody had ever measured it since then. And that intrigued them a lot. So one thing led to another, and they eventually, this is just sort of boilerplate legal stuff, but just explaining they used very careful, precise, professional survey methods, the same that anybody from the Geological Survey or any other organization would have used if they were doing a good job. So the results are on this website, which I'll be displaying again. You can go look at that if you want to, but they were just interested if they could figure out what was the highest natural rock in 1897 that was surveyed, and was it measured accurately with that elevation, or did the fire tower construction destroy that part of the summit? And then the other question we were interested in was McGillicuddy correct in asserting that he was on the highest point of the mountain in 1875, 317 feet south of the tower. So they started out by setting up their benchmark. This is down by Hill City. There's an established benchmark there that is tied into the railroad line. It goes right by the back of the picture there, tied into history and an exact number that you can start from. So these electronic devices are gathering information from satellites and land-based devices that give you a very precise elevation and location. And then you carry all that stuff up to the summit and set it up and do the same thing there, measuring your precise location and elevation, as well as shooting bearings around the summit, and also going in the tower even and measuring up the steps and to the top. And very thorough survey. I was really amazed. Had some help along the way here once in a while, but so there's Jerry. I'm just holding the pole. That was my job, but and taking some pictures. But so we're in the tower there. So we had this question about the highest natural rock in 1897, and this is something I was able to help with a little bit because I had found this picture that, again, these aren't very often found. A photo before there was any tower there. They're sort of scarce as far as I can tell. So this shows the summit before the tower was on top of it. And so you can kind of lay these on top of each other. You can see right where that photographer was standing. Everything is matching up very, very well there. And therefore we know that the summit was that piece of rock there near the table as it existed. And that's on about the same level as that window ledge. So they were kind of using that window ledge as like, hey, this is where the original summit, the elevation would have been. And there's a possibility of a small inaccuracy there. The highest natural remaining rock on top of Black Elk Peak is over on the other side of the tower where there used to be a flagpole mounted. You can go over there today and still see the broken off post there where the flag was once mounted there. The other question about McGillicuddy on the other spire, they did, again, measuring carefully on that, and shooting a bearing over to that tower and then over to that spire, and as well as over to the tower from this location. I'm over there just sitting there holding this little reflector that their laser would hit, and measure that distance like down to just the micromillimeters. It's really pretty amazing. And so we did that one afternoon, and a beautiful view from over on that spire, by the way. It's great to be up there once in a while. So the conclusions were that the elevation has apparently not been measured since 1897. Over the past century or more, the elevation's been stated by various authorities at 7240 to 7244. That number gets adjusted when they change the map datum, which is sort of the framework that the whole map is hung on. So they had a Deadwood datum, but now they have a different one that they use. So not every official source was universally updated. That's why you see different numbers for Black Elk Peak on different maps and in books and so on. Various numbers have persisted. The recent survey where the tower was located found that the highest natural rock, not including the fire tower, was 7231.32. Historic photo comparisons estimated the highest natural rock before that at 7031.68, or just slightly higher than what still exists north of today's tower. And then calculations for changes in the map datums indicated the 1897 surveyors using the then current Deadwood datum were 13 feet too high when they recorded their elevation at 7240. They should have recorded 7227, according to Jerry and Kurt, using the Deadwood datum, which would be equal to 7231.68 on the current datum used today. All of this will probably get thrown out the window, or maybe it already has, because now they're using lasers shooting down from airplanes or satellites even, I think, that can very precisely measure the height and detail of all of these mountains and structures. I guess that's what's coming next. And then these datums that they call them, as I understand it, will go out of, somewhat out of vogue. But last conclusion, I think here, McGillicuddy Peak, the spire 300 feet south of the tower, measures 7229 at its highest remaining natural rock, 2 feet shorter than today's natural summit over by the tower. But the comparisons of the photo indicate the spire was taller in the past and could have been the original true summit, as McGillicuddy and others said back then. So the highest absolute point on the peak today is the tip of the lightning rod at 7262, and the roof peak was measured at 7257. So you can dig into all of that yourself on this website. Just penryfamily.com will get you in the neighborhood, and you can look up Harney Peak there. But all of his notes, Jerry's notes in particular, old maps and so on that he's dug up to verify his information and findings, and the benchmarks that they measured from and so on, are his sketches, which are really beautiful to look at, and you can see how precise he was trying to be with all of his work. I keep going up there once in a while just to work on old photos. Back in 2005, I took the one in the middle to match the one at the top, and then in 2022 I went back and did the same shot. And again, you can kind of see how now we've reverted back to kind of what it looked like 100 years ago with the mountain pine beetle epidemic, and I think that's probably a good thing for the forest overall. This is a shot just west of the tower, kind of a neat postcard view from the 1930s looking towards the cathedral spires, and just kind of eyeball the density of the trees there. And then in 2006 it was much denser, but just a few red trees. That was the very beginning of the mountain pine beetle epidemic. Had no idea, of course, when we shot these that was going on, but and then by 2022 a lot of those trees were just falling over. They didn't do any logging in this area, so it is a natural looking forest from that standpoint. A lot of what's standing are spruce trees that were immune to the mountain pine beetle. They have their own bugs, but they made it through. But again, I believe this is a healthier forest. You certainly have more open views than we did back in 20 years ago, so it's been interesting to see that. Well, just to wrap up here, this is what I'm working on right now. I'm trying to do some then and now stuff across the whole state. I've been working on this for about 5 years, and I'm hoping I got a couple more to go to try to put a book together, but trying to get to most of the decent sized towns and some small ones as well. Just shot this last summer, Rapid City, from the hill southeast of downtown. What's downtown now anyway, and I think this is the same spot. Yeah, it's pretty striking to see that from a stereo view. That other one was 1876, so this is down by Edgemont there in the Pickles, and a lot of times trees are in my way, and so I'm now looking for more elevated positions around the state, like where a grain elevator was used as a place to take a picture. The grain elevator is no longer there, but you can put a drone up to that spot and take a picture from that angle. So kind of using that approach, but sometimes street level works very well, as it did down in Custer here recently when I did this one. But now I'm worried about cars coming at me. The wagon was a half a block away, you had plenty of time, but they come around that corner and they want to get to Wyoming. I'm on Facebook. I'm not saying you should be by any means, but if you are, and you want to follow what I'm doing, you can follow my page. You don't even have to sign up or anything, and then sometimes put stuff on there that I'm doing. I encourage you to get a book from the Journey Museum here if you want to today. I've got a few more in the car if we run out, don't worry. And
Yeah, we're working on this Custer Expedition. That's the latest book that's come out here, the 4th edition, and also on my website if you want to look up any of the other books I've done. So thank you so much. I know I went a little over my time. We will take some questions. So again,